our last sort of panel discussion. We still have a couple of things happening, but here's our last panel discussion or presentations, if you will. It's going to be about global partnerships, as Julia mentioned. And our first speaker is going to be Rebecca Nelson. And as you might be able to already see, if you can see her on your screen, she's actually joining us with her class at Cornell. So that's really exciting. And Rebecca will be introducing the Soil Factory Network. And Rebecca is a professor in the School of Integrative Plant Science and the Department of Global Development at Cornell University for the last 21 years. So from 2000 to 2021, she served as scientific director for the McKnight Foundation's Collaborative Crop Research Program. Rebecca's laboratory works on plant disease resistance and mycotoxin management, which has recently brought her to the focus on circular economy for organic resources with a particular interest in ecological sanitation. So without further ado, Rebecca, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. A huge thanks to Julia and the Rich Earth Institute for this wonderful meeting. I really feel like very grateful for being part of the Rich Earth Institute's larger network. And I'm happy to present the Soil Factory Network, which I hope can benefit from the Rich Earth's wider network on the many things that this group is working on. I've been super impressed by the last couple of days and really looking forward to revisiting it all through the recordings. And having appreciated our initial plenary speaker, I went out and bought the book Change. I have a couple other books called How Change Happens, but I did appreciate the recommendation there from that first speaker and the importance of networks for making change. And so I want to introduce the Soil Factory Networks group here because I think by connecting with the Rich Earth group, we'll be expanding the reach of this thinking. So we have collaborators in India that I'll mention, funded by the Tata Cornell Institute and amplified through that, and also going forward, hopefully through the ECHO network. But the main one is sanitation first, which I'll mention next. And then in Kenya, a couple of key partners, one of which I'll mention. We have a bunch of things going on in Cornell that I'll touch upon in greater length. And I'm pleased that we are connected with Burning Man Project and the McKnight Foundation's larger network of many grantees, several of which are working on circular economy for organic resources. So at last year's meeting, my colleagues from Fumagaskia, a large farmer network in Niger, and others were featured in a panel. So I won't say more about that, but I am really excited about the connections that we can amplify this work through the McKnight network as well. So Sanitation First is an organization that has around 5,000 source separating toilets in India in different institutional and domestic contexts. And they were really excited to hook up with the Soil Factory Network because of the idea of now using the material that they connect for agricultural purposes. And for example, so David Crossweller, I've been meeting with him regularly. We have a PhD student coming on board, and they've been able to gather additional resources now in light of this thinking. So their idea is to now start using their source separated material to produce biochar, for example, combine that with compost to improve soils, produce more food and non-food products, and increase the well-being of their welfare of their communities. My key partner in Kenya is Charles Mideka. The students will have seen him earlier this week talking about black soldier flies and their use in circular economy. Charles did a serious inventory of local organic resources in Kisumu in western Kenya, and we've been thinking about how overall the health of Lake Victoria and of local soils can be increased through multiple pathways using these different waste streams, including human excreta. So in these cases, we're thinking sort of the most local loop here. So how can ultra local neighborhood scale micro enterprises create, take waste and turn it into wealth and through small enterprises, particularly those that benefit high density urban and peri-urban settings. And I was inspired by a visit some years back to this real IPM program where they're growing a tremendous amount of food on the roadside in Kenya, and could urine be used in this kind of growth production capability? And you'll see a reference to that later here. Now, I felt as a member of this network that I should know sort of get some hands-on experience. So I know that the sanitation community doesn't believe in sort of putting it on the household, but I felt that given the realities of the pandemic, I better get some hands-on experience at the household. So I think I'm now an expert at the use of different funnels and arrangements domestically. I put Richard's freeze-thaw cycle to the test in the most primitive possible way there when it was winter. Scored a $1,900 Ford Ranger to do my collection routines around Cornell. When we've had some incipient work now with a Peace Cycling Club, we had a Master's of Public Health student chipping in on that. We now have a club called Ithacans, collecting urine for the planet. And we've gotten, noticed that the students can't help put a lot of awesome puns on their collection. And it was just this week that we finally got shut down by the authorities on this whole endeavor. So I think that's sort of a landmark in itself, which we'll have now to figure out how to overcome. So, that hasn't completely stopped us because we have I'm part of the nifty porta potty movement here. We've got a couple of these units that a friend of mine made. I'm calling it the Ecoloo. John Fuchs, the maker, calls it the Fuchs for the feces and urine collection hospitality suite. No, it's a John Fuchs. Anyway, so we're collecting a certain amount of material through this means. And then our local value chain is to use straw bale gardens. So we now have we had three straw bale gardens going this summer, 2 on 2 different Cornell farms and 1 on our little soil factory site. You can see that got an apple tree growing in one, switchgrass round bale and a happy rhubarb plant in another. And so then we decided to sort of upscale that a bit. We recruited our landscape architect friends. There's Cheryl Wong presenting in our diaphanous projection suite there at the soil factory. And so we did some scale design work with cardboard models. And this is what came of it. We got a new upgraded 500 bale straw bale array here that we'll plan to, we've got a fertigation system going. Thanks for the hot tips on better and worse fertigation do's and don'ts. We've got our first couple of treatments on there by now. So we're also really keen to figure out how on a really ultra local scale to use the human solid waste in a safe way. So I'm on board with the thermochemical conversion scheme. I think our current challenge now is to figure out how to dry the solid waste sufficiently that we can turn them into biochar efficiently at small and medium scales. And I have to acknowledge, talking about biochar, the role of Johannes Lehmann, who's our local biochar expert. We've got a new postdoc coming on, and she was on the line at least the first day. And so there's Johannes in various contexts to the right. We're working with local artists, or not local artists, and in this case, a Nicaraguan cartoonist, to figure out how can we, through different communication means, get messages across, including to children, about these things. So we have a lot of art and community events at this space we call the Soil Factory, some of which is lighthearted and some of which is community-hearted. Sorry. Here we're working with Ithaca's quite distinguished sustainability coordinator, trying to figure out whether we could actually cross the line to turn the municipal biosolids into biochar. And we would hope that eventually we could capture the nutrients from urine onto the biochar. At this point, we resoundingly cannot afford to undertake this really fancy turnkey operation, but we're still trying to figure out how to make that happen. And we have the goal, of course, of be able to return nutrients from the urban and peri-urban areas out to our rural areas, with the dream eventually of actually having that be a major theme for the global fertilizer, at least reducing the global fertilizer trade in petrochemically produced material. I've been kind of motivated to work in this area by realizing that plant health is a function of soil health, and that the mycotoxin problem that is particularly critical in tropical areas is, we can't solve it unless we actually bring nutrients, make nutrient cycles happen. So could we have NPK from urine come together with carbon from feces, and then also biological agents that can help directly combat the problem of mycotoxins? And so with that, thank you so much. Really look forward to the next talks and to interacting with the group further.
So thank you so much, Rebecca. That was awesome. It's so good to see the students involved and all the beautiful artistic creativity that's happening along with that project. That's really fun. So our final presenters of the summit, not our final thing, but our final presenters, are Will Tarpeh and Kory Russel. And Will is an assistant professor of chemical engineering at Stanford University. He leads a research group focused on designing and evaluating novel separations to recover valuable products from wastewaters. Will completed his BS in chemical engineering at Stanford, his MS and PhD in environmental engineering at UC Berkeley, and postdoctoral training at the University of Michigan in environmental engineering. Will has recently been honored as an environmental science and technology early career scientist in Forbes 30 Under 30, 2019 Science List Gulf Research Program Early Career Fellowship, and Chemical and Engineering News Talented 12. Kory Russel is an assistant professor of landscape architecture and environmental studies at the University of Oregon, where he teaches courses on sustainable and human-centered design, courses on water, sanitation, and public health, as well as courses in environmental studies. He has conducted extensive research internationally, including in Haiti and Mozambique, and they will be talking about the container-based sanitation work that they are doing. Take it away, Will.
I'm going to play a video from Kory because he's actually teaching right now. So I'll play his video first, and then I'll give a few more slides talking about the Container-Based Sanitation Alliance and how we're thinking about involving urine collection and treatment even more so over the next year or so. So here's Kory's presentation. Let me know if you can't see or hear. Yeah.
Hey everyone, my name is Kory Russel. I'm a professor of landscape architecture and environmental studies at the University of Oregon, and I'm the chair of the Container-Based Sanitation Alliance. Sorry I couldn't be joining you live. Unfortunately, I'm teaching a class at this time, so we decided I could give a quick update via recorded message. So last year we put together a panel specifically on container-based sanitation, and you know, we've been working to really integrate more urine aspects into the container-based sanitation model in a way that could be sort of more game-changing at the Container-Based Sanitation Alliance. But what I thought would be helpful here, because I think what Will is going to be talking about is going to be super useful. I thought what would be helpful here is to sort of give a little bit of background about what the CBSA has been up to over the last year and how that sets up a lot of the potential opportunities that Will's going to be talking about. So first off, what is container-based sanitation? So if you're unaware of what container-based sanitation is, it consists of end-to-end service that collects waste hygienically from waterless toilets built around sealable, removable containers. And those containers are collected on a regular basis, sometimes once a week, twice a week, once a month, whatever the service model needs. And those containers are removed from the community and taken to a waste recovery and treatment site. And a number of different waste products are then created, waste resource products. Here we have Sanovation making charcoal briquettes, soil making compost, Mosan making biochar, Luwat making biogas, and recently Sanergy was just a finalist in the Earthshot Prize, so they were top 26, and they're producing black soldier fly and compost from their feed. So the container-based sanitation is a group of organizations around the world that are actually serving significant populations of people with container-based sanitation. We're roughly somewhere around 170, 180,000 daily users around the world currently. And one of the things that we're really looking at is now how do we take that beachhead and expand it to really start to answer the big sanitation goals that are under the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. So one of the things that we're looking at more and more, right, because what container-based sanitation is largely focused on up to this point is the feces side of the equation. But one of the things that we've started to think about is how do we prioritize research around urine, especially in the context of delivering these services in many areas that are difficult to serve, logistically difficult to serve. And so one of the things that we did was, as part of the APRU Sustainable Cities and Landscapes Hub, we held a 2-day research symposium this last December, in which we invited Will to come speak, as well as some other researchers, specifically looking at the potentials and what is the sort of current state of art when it comes to resource recovery with urine, and how we could start to integrate that. And so the real goal long term is that we can economically harvest urine and integrate that into the CBS service chain. And that is going to require piloting. And so I'll let Will, talk about some of the different exciting things that are happening on that front, but that is really where our goal is. And that fits into sort of some of the developments that have happened since last year's Rich Earth Institute. And the Richest Earth Institute really kindly and very generously donated many of the funds that were raised for the attendance to the conference last year, to the CBSA, which was super helpful and kept us going in what was a lean year, I will say. But since that time, we've been able to start to use that year to both release several things and to start a sort of a trajectory towards being able to actually scale this idea of container-based sanitation. And that has meant bringing on some new donors. It's meant we're now starting to look for an executive director to build up a bit of the capacity of the CBSA to really start to support new entrants and entrants that are already here with scaling. So how do we scale alternative urban sanitation like CBS with urine waste recovery in there? Part of what we've seen is the most significant challenge is financing scale up. That remains a significant barrier. And the reason is really multi-level, right? There's perceptions of CBS as an expensive option, and I'll talk about that next, where we've released some stuff that should help with that. There's a lack of familiarity with CBS cost structures. So, typical infrastructure is very reliant on big upfront capital costs and then lower OpEx over time, whereas there's low CapEx costs for CBS, but the OpEx remains a little higher. But that does not mean that it's more costly. There's expectations that CBS services should be fully cost recovery, which unfortunately is just sort of not possible when you're talking about servicing some of the most economically challenged communities around the world. And there is going to need to be public-private partnerships. There's going to need to be cross-subsidization to make it as affordable as possible for the lowest income individuals. And so to that end, one thing that we undertook and released this last year after the talk at the Rich Earth Institute was a cost effectiveness analysis that EY performed. And they looked at Haiti, Ghana, Kenya, Peru, and Madagascar, and they gathered standardized cost information through company financial data and in-depth interviews. They used climate and costs in urban sanitation, the Cactus methodology for field data baselines. And they built an extensive like-for-like comparison of different sanitation options in urban slums and other low-income communities. And what they found is that a larger scale CBS service, and by larger scale, I'm talking like 1,000 households or so, was significantly cheaper is probably the wrong word, lower cost than the alternative sewers, septic tanks, and pit latrines. And why this is really, and even the median scale CBS service was lower across all three of those. And why this is important for urine is that CBS inherently, by its design, is capturing that urine waste in most cases separately. So we're already separating out and able to access that urine specifically if it makes economic sense to do so. Whereas in sewers, septic tanks, and pit latrines, that becomes more difficult to harvest that urine. And so if this is the lowest cost or the most cost-effective method, that really opens this up to being one of the key ways in which we could be delivering sanitation services around the world. Additionally, we looked at affordability, right? And so in affordability, the sort of rule of thumb, the benchmark, this is not written down in policy anywhere, but sort of the sort of idea is that 3 to 5% of annual income should be considered affordable for water and sanitation services. And what we found is that larger scale or shared CDS scales both came in at about 2% or lower for the context that we were looking at in these 5 countries. Now, does that mean that it's going to be affordable for everyone? No, but it is a significant indicator that this is actually sort of reaching some of the goals that we would like to see. So lastly, I think on the urine front, the other thing that we're looking at, right, is this idea of climate positive sanitation. So we've done a bunch of work on this and now presented a bit on it. And the issue here is that globally, sanitation accounts for somewhere between 2 and 6% of global anthropogenic methane. And one of the things that we know is that methane is super important to reduce if you want to slow climate change rapidly. And so if we're scaling up sanitation to meet SDG 6, we could inadvertently be making it harder to reach climate action on SDG 13. And so one of the things that we've really focused on is there a way to be doing this in a very emissions neutral or emissions free sort of way. And one of the things that CBS has going for it, because you're not using water, because you're using transport, which does not actually produce that much CO2, and over the long term will become electrified. So that's a small percentage of the overall emissions. The main emissions are actually in treatment and in the containment at the beginning. And so because it's a very rapid movement through the chain and turning it into a reuse product, oftentimes, which offsets a carbon intensive process. If it's like turning urine into fertilizer, that offsets, the Haber-Bosch process. If it's turning waste into charcoal briquettes, that's offsetting deforestation. There's a bunch of these sorts of things. And basically what we found through this research was that if CBS were scaled up to just 10% of the 1 billion people currently living in informal settlements, that would mean taking the equivalent of something like 17 to 46 million passenger cars off the streets on an annual basis. All right, so with that, I will turn it over to Will, and hopefully if you have any questions, please contact us. We'd love to hear from you. All the best.
Okay, great. So that was some great information from Kory, especially on the climate positive part. So now I'll just share a few slides to seed some discussion, since we have just about 15 minutes left. So I hope to leave some time at the end for discussions and questions. Sorry about that. This is the wrong thing. So yeah, so Kory and I have started meeting actually because of the Rich Earth Summit last year. And so we started thinking about how can we do a little more work on formalizing the interactions between urine researchers and the Container-Based Sanitation Alliance. Sorry, give me 1 second. And so starting in last December, we started talking about some of the more specific details here. So. I'm sorry, having a little trouble finding the right window to share, but I think we are there. Rich Earth folks, are you all seeing the right screen?
It says that the screen is sharing, but it's just blank.
Okay. Okay.
This
Now it
looks
should
more
be okay.
promising.
Okay.
Yeah, we can see your slides on the, never mind.
Okay, and now it should be right this way, yeah?
Yes.
Okay, perfect, sorry about that. Great, so yeah, so just to finish out this session and the speaking part of the summit, we thought we'd talk some more about global partnerships for urine reclamation, especially with SDGs. So this image is a picture from a recent paper led by Tova Larsen talking about how urine diversion and urine treatment can expressly address several sustainable development goals. And so this is a really big part of the conversation on a global scale. And so it's important to kind of ground the conversation in these SDGs. And so what Kory and I have been talking about over the past year is sort of making this vision of a CBSA urine consortium a reality in terms of connecting what we're doing in the US and in Europe with other settings in low and middle income countries. And so the idea here is to leverage perspectives from this great resource of multiple CBS providers with unique technologies, with unique solutions, and with unique approaches and settings to accelerate the impact of urine valorization in the context of CBS. And so the three kind of areas here are to synthesize and summarize CBS specific needs and constraints for urine treatment, because much of our work has focused on sewered settings, but we also need to think about the vast majority of people without access to conventional sewers. And then ranking existing technologies and defining aspirational targets where we want to get to guide people who develop technologies. And then, of course, to accelerate out of the lab through pilot scale and to demonstration and field scale. So, of course, there are multiple stakeholders here kind of gathering around this proverbial table of the CBS Urine Consortium. So first things first, let's focus on synthesizing CBS specific needs. So as Kory mentioned, when we're not using water to convey urine and instead we're transporting it, that means we need to think really concretely about the most efficient ways to do that. And so since urine is by far majority water, increasingly we've found over and over again that the closer to the source of excretion, the more efficient we can be. And so there are several value propositions we can achieve with urine diversion and treatment, such as reducing volume for transport, making urine-enriched products, and making liquid fertilizers, and increasingly other types of products in addition to fertilizers. And so in several places around the world, we found that sometimes the value of urine-derived fertilizers is actually just that they're locally sourced. And so these are some data from a project funded by the Water Research Foundation that wasn't on urine specifically, but was looking at nitrogen and phosphorus removal technologies, which of course has some overlap with urine. And so this was surveys of several practitioners, around 80 practitioners in the field. And so these were the things they were most likely to consider versus least likely to consider, most likely in green, least likely in gray. And so we can see here that cost and energy consumption are kind of the big things that practitioners are worried about, and then effluent limits, regulations, and removal efficiency. And so greenhouse gas emissions they're thinking about, but not always as much as some of those other factors. So we were my group is part of the outcome of the Water Research Foundation project was this kind of systematic review and evaluation of nutrient removal. And again, not focused specifically on urine, but on wastewater treatment, broadly speaking. But this approach can be used and tailored to urine treatment. And so what we did here was look at several different, we looked at over 150 different technologies. And what we did is score them based on what we found in the literature along several axes, like removal efficiencies, cost, energy consumption, et cetera. And so we're thinking of using a similar approach, but just focused on urine focused treatments in the future. And so some of the aspirational targets that might be important for a CBS setting are things like logistically simple, a mature market for the products we make, and then of course cost can be really important because of low margins. In terms of accelerating the lab to field transition, it's been great to see during the summit progress kind of each year at more and more pilot scale and demonstration scale techniques. And so the benefit of doing this through the CBSA are things like coordinated pilots. What if we can take the same technology and apply it in 5 or 6 different settings around the world and get all of that data at once? Same thing for urine variation. It always comes up that we're not quite sure, or urine compositions can vary, but we're not always sure to what extent. Also comparing regulations and constraints in different settings, and eventually getting to standardized reporting metrics and identifying what factors really enable the acceleration of urine diversion so that we can use those moving forward and actually leverage those. So the goal here is to develop a report on urine treatment technologies for container-based sanitation that's focused on kind of general global insights and also site-specific insights, because we've been doing a lot of work in one site at a time, but there might be some value, or we expect there to be value in comparing and contrasting setting-specific constraints. And then, of course, integration with feces valorization. The future uses of this report are scoping future research and development. These are things that for technology developers in particular, when we have targets or we understand the problem, especially for a multifaceted problem like urine diversion, the better we can do at designing better technologies and defining what better means. Also informing collection logistics and guiding product choices and marketing. So including fertilizer, of course, but thinking what else might we be able to make from urine. And there's been some great work that we've seen over the course of the summit here as well. And just as a sample of this, this is some report from, this is a graph from some of my own work with Sanergy, where we were looking at the costs, relative costs of fertilizers in Kenya and globally compared to exhausting the urine to a treatment plant, local treatment plant, and also using ion exchange to recover nitrogen. So potential modes of interaction here that we're interested in kind of delving into in this initiative are synthesizing these needs and constraints with surveys and focus groups from CBS partners, and kind of having this be a regular occurrence, and then ranking technologies based on some framework that we develop, and then eventually moving towards the lab, out of the lab and into the field. And of course, urine diversion is something we're all envisioning for the future. So building capacity both in low and middle income countries and with students here in the US and in other areas as well, where many of us are based, is critically important, because that's going to guide the future of what we do. And so the hope here is that through this type of survey work, broadly speaking, we can begin to build teams for grant proposals and also actually guide funding agency priorities who are thinking about urine diversion. So with that, I wanted to just highlight a couple ongoing and recent piece of literature on standardizing urine treatment. So Tova, Michelle, and Kai, I think Michelle and Kai are both on the call, published this fantastic critical review of urine treatment technologies. And it was great to see, because some of the highlights here, definitely in the past 15 years, we've seen a huge increase in urine treatment technologies. And so that it's far time that we kind of assessed where we are and where we're going to. And there's been some great progress moving towards industrialization. And then for me, thinking about electrochemistry, there's been a real increase in electrochemical treatment technologies. And of course, some of that we see here in the Urine Summit, and some of it is still very, very bench scale that we see at chemical society conferences and engineering type of conferences. But it's really critical to be able to kind of translate between those two worlds. Another one from Tova is the one I mentioned at the beginning, this SDG agenda. And so I think this is another great report for us to think about situating our work within SDGs, because when we talk about global partnerships, SDGs are kind of the first part of most conversations. One last thing about standardizing, with the Michigan team, we're finalizing a paper on a pharmaceutical framework to guide comparison of treatment technologies. So all of that to say, there's work going on standardizing urine treatment. We need to keep developing new technologies. We're also at a stage where we need to be comparing them and contrasting them so that we can translate them to practitioners. So with that, I'll end there, and I'm happy to take questions and comments in the time we have left.
Awesome. Thank you so much, William. It's really fun to hear of another collaboration that sort of came out of the summit last year, and to see the progression of that project. So thank you for that update, and look forward to the further updates, the future updates as well.